that was tied to his old lifestyle, his old worldliness. And when he surrendered that part of himself and took it out, he had actually, his relationship went from, it kind of accelerated. It was like the straw that broke the camel's back, is that last little step of obedience. And it's like, whoa, he had like an Acts Pentecost type moment with the Lord.
Welcome to the Days of Noah podcast, where we talk all things biblical, supernatural, and strange. This week, Luke, Don, and myself are going to continue our discussion on the Nephilim connection to the Federal Reserve, going over an interview with intercessor Tim Bence with Rob Skiba from about a decade or so ago.
Good morning.
Good morning. How's everybody?
Doing good,
all
sir.
Right.
Good. Last week, Luke and I kind of laid the groundwork for that whole Tim Bence interview, and so we never got to very much of the Jekyll Island stuff. We were kind of talking about his overseas ventures dealing with Canaanite altars in the Middle East.
Right.
There was enough to unpack there, and so, so it worked out well to kind of split this up into a few parts.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Cool.
So, awesome. Well, welcome back, and, so let's just recap really quick kind of where we left off. So, in talking about Tim Bence's amazing story that he detailed with Rob Skiba years ago, he had been directed by the Lord to deal with these Canaanite ancient altars that had been allowed to exist thousands of years after their creation, likely. Maybe Israel didn't deal with them how they were supposed to, or these were Canaanite altars that were set up when the diaspora of the giants spread, Joshua's holy wars against them, and so these guys spread to Germany and all sorts of other places and probably set up altars. So Tim's heading back to home to the U.S. I believe he lives in Oklahoma, and he's pretty tired, pretty wiped out. He's been gone for like 3 months. He misses his family, and God says, I have one more job for you to do, and the timing of it is important. And so God directs him to Jekyll Island, Georgia. So that's kind of where we pick up from last time. And so one of the first things he did was he made a reservation at I don't know if it's just one hotel or a main hotel, but it's definitely historic because U.S. presidents used to stay in the suite that Tim was given. So when he booked his reservation and he met the woman at the desk, and she felt like she got a word from the Lord about giving him this room, this presidential suite that had just been remodeled, and he was the first one to stay in it since a U.S. president in the 40s, I think. So that was pretty cool. So that, like Luke pointed out last week, that was kind of just an extra, icing on the cake blessing from God to give him this special room that no one had stayed in all these years, and it was a presidential suite. And what the woman at the desk said was God told her that he was an ambassador. And she says, I looked you up and I couldn't find any information about, that you were some dignitary from some country or anything. And Tim kind of explained to her, well, I'm I kind of have a unique position. God has a special assignment for me, and I'm representing Him. And what's interesting too is that he says, I didn't know yet why I was there, but I obeyed God in what I did know. And I think it's interesting to point out that there's kind of a general revelation towards specific revelation principle that often we see in our Christian life and in the Bible. That, if we're open to kind of a general leading of the Lord or something He's revealed generally, then He often will direct us more specifically. Like you see that with Cornelius in the Bible, right? He had some idea of this Messiah, but he didn't have the full picture.
Yeah, I was reminded of a missionary that came to our church years ago, and he was preaching on just yes, and it's like you said, God might give a certain leading, prompting direction, and as you're saying yes to that, that yes will open up other opportunities to say yes, yes, yes. And he ended up, his story was kind of unique, but he said yes to living in a Section 8 housing. And obviously he didn't need to stay there, but he was led to go there to minister to the people there. But it was through a series of yeses, he ended up moving his whole family into Iraq as a missionary. But so Tim Bence definitely was obedient throughout his life with those yeses and how the Lord would lead him, and then more information would come. So it's pretty interesting to hear his testimony on this.
Yeah, and I think the reverse is true too, right? Because as people go through life, they say if you haven't become a believer in Christ, before you're 20 or 30 years old, like the chances go way down. And so we kind of get hardened into the position that we've already taken. And I have to believe that, God is a loving and just God. He gives everybody, whether you're on some, remote third world island tribe somewhere that's, like if they saw the technology and the way we live, they would just they wouldn't believe it because it's just so foreign to them. Or you're in, modern America with all of our creature comforts. Like God gives people ways to reveal Himself to them, and I feel like the more people shut off those little inclinations of God, then He's continually closing the door a lot of times. But again, the positive is true too, that the more we open ourselves up, the more He reveals. And I think it's interesting too how Tim worded it many times, like having a conversation with God or hearing directly. And I would never, try to base any sort of theology on that or say that has to be for every believer. But I think it's important as we're talking about supernatural things on this show that we recognize that, there are times where, whether it's, solely at God's direction that He's doing that, for whatever reason, like we all have different spiritual gifts, that He decides He's going to do that in certain cases, or maybe with certain people. And maybe it's maybe it's a maturity in our beliefs and obedience that's created. I don't know. You guys have any thoughts on that? Because that's not something I experience regularly, if at all.
Well, from one thing I think he touches on, part of it is it's basically a lifestyle that's totally unique to most Christians. So not only is the obedience there, but maybe there's a lifestyle. Really, when I look at it as holiness. So there's degrees of obedience. There's degrees of holiness, and And then I think there's when you're walking in a closer relationship with the Lord, you're purposely spending more time with Him throughout the day, the morning. The Bible talks about seeking Him early, you will find me. And then I think the Scripture talks about some of the giftings that there's different gifts given out, but I almost feel like it's, if you find the one that you have and you're practicing in that, like He might give you a little bit of a taste of what prophecy is.
Right.
It's like, well, okay, well, I'm gonna go. I got a word for this person, but if I never go talk to that person, that with that word of knowledge that I receive, is God going to continue to give you words?
Yeah, at some point you have to step out.
You got to step out, and then as you practice in that gift, you get better at it. You get greater sensitivity. You get
greater discernment.
That's kind of how I envision it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Obviously, we all got our issues, our challenges, our giftings, but that's kind of how I envision it. It's a level of holiness, and then it's a maturity to actually walk out those gifts and to use those talents. And yeah, Tim Bence has got some unique stuff, because we hear in that interview, he talks about his relationship with the Lord even as a child, the sensitivities that he had even back then. So it's many decades of walking with the Lord that led to this Jekyll Island obedience.
And I want to put a pin in that, as they say, and come back to that on another show, because after he gets through this whole interview about Jekyll Island and so on, he does talk a great deal about some of his spiritual journey and things that he had to deal with as God prompted him in his life to get to the point where he could be the one to deal with these big spiritual strongholds, these Canaanite altars. But real quick, I want to say just one comment on that, and then ask Don what he thinks. In the Bible, it talks about being filled with the Spirit, and I've heard it put this way, and it seems to be confirmed by those type of verses that yes, we get the Spirit at conversion, but there is perhaps an ebb and flow to that, because why else would Paul say, be filled? So to me, it's kind of a degree where there's more yielding, and you see more fruit, more of God's power as we are more yielding towards Him versus less. Not that we ever lose God's Spirit, but there's maybe a degree of filling. And I think conversely, for those, depending on how much they're given over to, the dark side, the occult, the demonic, the satanic, they can rise in ranks in degrees of power that way. So
I would agree with you on that, and then I want to hear Don's response. Yeah, it's levels of yielding, because I remember a story of a friend of mine who was seeking the Lord for a greater anointing and whatever, and it happened to be an earring that he had in his ear.
Oh wow!
That was tied to his old lifestyle, his old worldliness, and when he surrendered that part of himself and took it out, his relationship went from, it kind of accelerated. It was like the straw that broke the camel's back. Is that last little step of obedience, and he's like, whoa, he had like
that's amazing,
an Acts Pentecost type moment with the Lord. And you wouldn't think that a little hoop earring would be that, but it was that last step of obedience that he needed to surrender.
Oh, I think that a lot of it was already said with you guys talking. But one thing I wanted to bring up kind of at the beginning of the show was I have in my notes, I have it in capital letters a couple of times through the notes, verbal conversation with God, ? Pretty much. But, I think it'd be naive for me to think that just because I haven't heard a verbal conversation from God, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And also, he never said verbal. He just said, the Lord told me. And so I've had the Lord tell me things too. I've had, and I've also resisted that. And when you say being filled with the Spirit, I think that, I agree with Luke with what he was saying, that it's this yielding that brings you into this better relationship with God. And I can tell you in my life where I am too hard of heart to yield. And I ask God, I say, well, I'd love to yield this to you, but, that's what I think that's what I think this gentleman did, is he yielded pretty much everything, more than likely, and was able to be led around.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And real quick, go ahead, Luke.
No, I know you wanted to put a pin in it, but I just want to get a little bit more about his character, Tim Bence.
Sure.
Because he brought it up in the part 2, and even another interview that I heard. As he's seeking the Lord and he's asking the Lord to judge his own heart, the Lord was revealing things to him that was in his heart that he had no idea of.
Right, that he had never done.
That he had never surrendered, never knew that he needed to. But it was something that, from the Lord's perspective, looking at his character, I see that thing. There's a place in you that maybe there's a stronghold, maybe it's just your own will that needs to surrender. And you remember the story he gave dealing with hatred. We're put a pin in that. I'm not going to go there, but
it's okay.
But it's
the gatekeeper's principle.
But it was the willingness to yield and be like, okay, I know I'm not perfect. I'm striving for holiness. I'm striving for perfection. But okay, Lord, examine me, judge me, bring to the surface the things that I need to deal with.
As David asked.
And he's just developed a lifestyle of doing that through, childhood to adulthood, that led him to such a level of sensitivity that he's able to be led and get these directions to Jekyll Island, I think, is where we're.
That makes sense. And yeah, we'll definitely devote more time to that. And just real quick, along the lines of the earring thing. So I used to have a couple in my left ear, and I had can I say my funny nickname I was given at work? So I had a little stud and I had a little cross. And so one guy at work in my old job like 20 years ago gave me the nickname Honky LT. You get the reference? Lawrence Taylor? Okay. So yeah, that's still my eBay name if you guys want to look me up on eBay. Anyway, but eBay, this relates to eBay actually. This is interesting. So I was kind of inquiring of God about that very same thing, because I was living by myself. I moved out from my roommates. I lived by myself for a couple years, and I was getting into Ray Comfort's Hell's Best Kept Secret series, which is a lot of good teachings and very challenging in there. And he was talking about, I don't know if it was an earring or a guy having sunglasses while he was preaching or something like that, where it was like God saying, convicting him over something. And listen, I don't want to be legalistic or say people are, sinning by having earrings or tattoos or anything. This is kind of on an individual basis, at least the way God works. And so I started asking God that same question for, is this something that bothers you? And in kind of a very rudimentary, infantile way, I prayed a selfish prayer and I said, okay, God, I've got 10 things on eBay for sale. I didn't expect more than half of them to sell because I was like, whatever, put all these different things on there. And I said, if this is truly something you want me to part with, let them all sell. And they did, all within like a week. And to me, God met me where I was at, and he gave me that confirmation to say that, And so that's kind of what we're talking about, that yielding, not a legalistic way of it's the same for everybody. But all right, back to the story. So he gets to the hotel. He's talking to the clerk there at the desk, the lady, and she said, she had an inner voice in her mind of God telling her things and she had never had that happen before. So I think that's interesting that almost as a byproduct, right? That Tim was sensitive to this, as you described, Luke, of a lifetime of yielding. And then it kind of spilled over into the people he interacted with. I think that's kind of neat. All right, so she sets up a meeting with the museum's director for the next day. She gives him a free night at the hotel there, so he had booked one day. She gives him a second day. And she's able to book most of the day with this museum director. And still, Tim doesn't really know why he's quite there yet, although things are starting to come into place. So he meets with the museum director, and he's showing him the grounds and different things, and the different cabins that all of these, financial magnates had built, and they were very low key. That these were the wealthiest men in the world that built this. So just a little background: the Jekyll Island area there, that was like a club. It was like, I don't know, Martha's Vineyard today or something. Like, this is where the elite went to relax and have a vacation and things like that. And it's a pretty small island. I think I looked it up. It's only like 7 miles wide by like a mile and a half or something. So I don't know, smaller than like Mackinac Island in Michigan. But anyway, so they had these cabins, and they were very low key. I wonder if that was almost to hide their names, continue in anonymity. But that whole area there, that was as we'll get into, the Native Americans, the Temeculans, all their villages, and these cabins were built on top of that. So the director talks about this group of Native Americans, the Temeculans, and he said that they were quite prolific among several states in the southeast U.S. So this was not just Jekyll Island. It was Florida. It was Georgia, some of the other coastal states. And I did a quick search a little bit about that tribe, and it's estimated there were hundreds of thousands of them in that area long ago. And again, we're going to connect these dots, but we're talking about, the diaspora, the spreading of the Canaanites because they were being hunted down. And so it's interesting that we're connecting that to the spreading out and how prolific they were in the U.S. This was not, well, before it was the United States, but this was not just on Jekyll Island that they had this group of people. So they would have been well established. And then he talks about how he has full skeletons in the museum. And Tim asks, "Can we see them?" He says, "Yeah, they're able to be seen." And these skeletons were 8 to 8.5 feet tall. And the museum director said that all of the Temeculans were unusually tall, even the women. And then another detail he brings up is that there was a French colony that came to the area. This was, I think, in the 1500s, so shortly after Columbus. And they were engaged in interacting with this tribe. And according to the museum director, he says that they were so appalled by what they saw the natives engaged in, and I can only imagine, maybe it was blood sacrifice or different things like that, that they fled in the dark of night down to Florida to what became St. Augustine and established that city. And I found out recently St. Augustine is called America's oldest city. So that's really interesting. So this was early 1500s. And I personally find it a little ironic that the city it's named after, right, St. Augustine or Augustine, he himself dismissed the Nephilim as a fabrication, as you know, myth and fantasy. So that to me is kind of ironic. And in the museum, okay, there was a painting, and this was a copy of the painting, not the original, but it showed these native peoples, the Temeculans, and it showed an altar on which the Native Americans were worshiping. And Tim brought up, you know, this altar looks very similar to ones that I saw in the Middle East. And I don't know of any Native Americans that build things like this. And it also showed some of the chiefs holding babies up by their ankles with, I don't know, some sort of machete type sword or knife ready to hack them up. And again, Tim points out, you know, that doesn't seem like something that I'm familiar with that Native Americans do. You know, this is more something that I see in the Middle East. And at that point, still, the museum director was insistent that this was, you know, this was a native, these were Native Americans. This was not some, you know, tribe that came over. But I think as we're discovering this and as the two of them are talking, they're figuring out that these people obviously came there much, much earlier. Yeah, so he connected both the weapons, the blood sacrifice that he saw pictured, the altar, to all these things he saw in the Middle East. And then so he's taken by the director to Rockefeller's house. And this is where it gets really interesting, because he takes him to the parlor in this house and says this is where the Federal Reserve had their secret meeting. I think it was it 1910? I don't know if you guys recall. 1912? Yeah, it was 1913, I think, was the Federal Reserve Act when they actually got it passed into law. But yeah, and he said, this is the, so the museum director says that altar, we're standing over it. And I kind of skipped a little detail there, but Tim goes, who would be crazy enough to build their house on top of this altar? And he said it was Rockefeller. So that's how he disclosed that. And man, that just makes me think of, you remember the story of Jesus healing the guy with legion, the demons? Mm-hmm. You know, he's got thousands or whatever of demons. And I want to read that section because it just reminds me of that. Like, what type of person would want to associate with something so dark? So in Luke 8, it says, chapter 26, they sailed to the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. When Jesus had stepped out on the land, he met a man from a city who had demons. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he had not lived in a house but among the tombs. So that's, to me, that's just a little bit of connection of like, if you're kind of not in your right mind, if you want to live among the tombs, you know, and then for someone to willingly build their house over this ancient death altar. But I'll go on with this. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell down before him and said with a loud voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High?" So the demons recognized who he was. "I beg you, do not torment me." And the version I copied here, doesn't say it, but he says, maybe it's later. Oh yes, okay. Let me keep going. For he had commanded. Okay, so they said with a loud voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many a time it had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the desert. So we don't have to necessarily go down that rabbit trail, but there's something connected to demons and dry places the Bible talks about, and that may be because they have a fear of water similar to do with the flood. There may be some connections there about dry places. And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion, for we are many." And they begged him, this is interesting, not to command them to depart into the abyss. And so the abyss, that's the same kind of language that like Peter uses from Enoch regarding Tartarus. So it's like the worst place of Hades. And if we are to take what the book of Enoch says about the judgment of these departed Nephilim spirits, it says that God permitted 1/10 of them to remain on the earth. So that makes me think the other 90% of them were sent into the abyss. So that may be where these demons are well acquainted with their parents, the Watchers, and most of their brethren being in this place of torment and not wanting to go there. And then, of course, Jesus sends them into a herd of pigs, and the pigs jump off the cliff. And I feel bad for the pig owners because they probably lost a lot of money. But, yeah, of course, we've talked a little bit about demons wanting to inhabit bodies. And so, that's why they were happy to go into an animal. But I don't know. I just think that's interesting about the tombs and Rockefeller. That draw to darkness,
Well, I think there's. I don't think he did it ignorantly. I think it was done on purpose. As there's many examples. I think I don't remember if it was this interview or another one. Was talking about a Canaanite altar that was brought to Germany, and they built a castle on top of it, or around it.
The seat of Satan, the altar of Zeus that we talked about last
So
time.
there's definitely an understanding, and if you go back to the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie, the Nazis in that film, and the Nazis in real life desired and used occult pagan practices to tap into receiving more power. Just like we were saying earlier, what are you yielding yourself to? They yielded themselves to evil forces. They were willing to take these altars, and I think one of the altars was, and maybe it's the one at that castle, that's where the SS, the elite Nazi special forces, did their initiations and stuff. It was right there in that castle where that altar was. So for Rockefeller to build that, and then him and his business partners, 1/4 of the world's wealth, coming there to Jekyll Island to plan out and defraud the United States citizens. And really, by their corruption, not only did it enslave us in the United States, other countries replicated what we did. You could look up, do a Google search, and look at the national debts around the world from Japan and others. They're just modeling our system.
And the Federal Reserve System that's been recreated. And interestingly enough, there was a memo or a plan that was identified that was drawn up, I think, in the late 90s. And it listed all these different countries that had yet to have a central bank. And if you look at the wars and conflicts that we entered in the 2000s and beyond, It's one after another. Syria, Iraq, I forget a bunch of the other ones. And with the exception of like North Korea and maybe Iran today, like every one of these countries on that list now has a central bank. But you're right. It's part of the enslavement that's gone on. And I think it's interesting too, and this is another path that we can go with our show at some point, but, Fritz, what's his last name? Schumacher? I forget. I've watched some videos, some old videos of him on Prophecy Club on YouTube, but he wrote the book 13 Bloodlines of the Satanic Bloodlines of the Illuminati. And a lot of those names, like Rockefeller, Rothschild, Morgan, Kennedy, all these big names are mentioned in that. So I think it's not an accident that Rockefeller built his house over the Canaanite altar and invited his wealthy friends to do it. But a lot of those names are identified as these ancient satanic bloodlines where they try to keep that power line intact, as we've talked about, and Dr. Laura Sanger's talked about, the growing iniquity force of connecting these bloodlines. So, in a strange way, you almost might think of this secret meeting as like a family reunion, because here's the Canaanite altar, and they may very well have a genetic tie, not just a spiritual tie that they're willing to do the same types of awful things, but
Yeah, I think Pastor Doug Riggs has even mentioned one of the royal family members, I don't remember which, was quoted in talking about his family history being traced back to Nimrod. He even verbalized it in an interview. So he might not have said Nimrod by name, but it was someone connected to Nimrod. Yeah.
Okay.
That it wasn't far removed. And it was a sense of pride that, yeah, we come from this lineage,
Fritz Springmeier, Bloodlines of the Illuminati. So that might be a good read. But he's got some old videos on YouTube where he was with the Prophecy Club group talking about
I actually
that.
own that, the Kindle
Do you
version.
really?
Yeah.
Ha!
I've had
That's
that
awesome.
for quite a few years.
Yep.
Due to certain...
Don, we're never going to run out of material.
No, I think that yes, I agree with you.
That book was actually banned in France because
wow.
Yeah. You can pick it up
because of French lineages. You think that were upset?
I'm trying to remember specifically. He had some very poignant words to some of the French historical politicians that were not favorable in the book. So their way of discrediting is like, yeah, we'll just ban your book, and the whole French. Yeah, since you don't like us, you say bad things about us.
He's naming names.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know.
That's interesting. Yeah, so once Tim Bence figured this out about the heritage of this building, this altar, and the Federal Reserve System that was conceived right there, he was trying to figure out what he's supposed to do, because he's like, God, I don't want to like destroy this historic house. How am I supposed to deal with this? And it was interesting that the museum director was sensitive to him being a godly praying man, and he actually said, "Hey, I'm going to go over here and read the newspaper. I'm sure you probably want to pray for a little while." And so Tim does that, and he inquires of the Lord how to deal with this. And so God kind of directed him in his mind about how to pray about it and everything. And the same type of thing happened overseas, where there was like an audible, like a tree trunk cracking type of sound this sonic boom kind of thing, and that was kind of the confirmation that he had dealt with this altar. And I believe in the interview, Tim says it was just like 5 days later that the Lehman Brothers Bank collapsed. So this was the beginning of the judgment on the banking system that God says he was going to do. Yeah. So just as the Canaanites, were a snare and an enslavement force thousands of years ago, subjugating humanity, so the conception of the Federal Reserve System was designed to enslave humanity in debt. And that's one of the things that God said to Tim was, I'm going to judge debt the same way I judged slavery in the Civil War. As he's equating it that way.
And I don't believe we're done. I believe the recession that took place 07, 8, 9 was a form of judgment, but we didn't learn anything. What is it? Jonathan Kahn, is it the Harbinger?
With the Harbinger, yeah.
And he talks a lot about signs that God gives us, because God is a merciful God, He's a gracious God, and but if you don't, you keep on, at some point you're going to run out of chances, and so I always wonder, there's got to be a time in the future. If the Bible says in Revelation, there's going to be a time, speaking of the mark of the beast, where you have that mark to buy and to sell. Okay, if we've gone to that level of commerce, or transacting of goods and services, where's the fiat currencies? Where's the U.S. dollar? Where's America? So has a collapse happened? Have we transitioned into something digital? Maybe a collapse happens and then we start over with a new monetary policy. So I always feel, and this is just my opinion, there's going to be a collapse to the U.S. economy sometime in the future. Well, will it happen in our life? I don't know. But I believe what took place in those years was a judgment. We didn't learn from it. There was bailouts. I think it was even described that if the amount of money that was paid to the banks to bail them out and keep them in business was given to the homeowners that were in debt, the whole nation could have reset and had been mortgage free and had debt free homes.
Yeah,
by the
that's
federal
incredible.
government.
No, and I think it's been talked about a lot. Luke and Nate mention it on Blurry Creatures at least once or twice, that there is a slow motion orchestrated crash that some of the elites are working towards, to try to have that great reset. So I think that's very likely going to usher in a new system that they have more control in. And we'll kind of circle back to that too, because I do want to, if not today, but more even so into the future, I want to talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve System. If people don't know kind of how that works and what happened there, but let's get into that in a few minutes. But I just want to kind of draw some parallels to what Tim is talking about and some of what Dr. Laura Sanger's work is talked about on defilement of the land. Because, it was driving out of the Nephilim out of their lands. That was not just a judgment on them, but it was also about restoring the land that had been defiled. And this is one of the things that Dr. Laura works with in her spiritual mapping. I think, Luke, you and I talked about it last week. And so she has kind of a team of people with gifts of discernment that go around and find these areas. So there's different ways that she does it. And I'm just starting, Luke, to read her book, The Roots of the Federal Reserve. And how she
mentions it in her interview with Nate and Luke on Blurry Creatures.
Yes.
One of the first, or maybe the second interview with, and basically spiritual mapping would take a person that's gifted in discernment, in combination with taking your natural ability to research an area historically, who lived here, and then with spiritual eyes seeing, okay, what kind of atrocities took place here? What kind of sin took place here? So we already mentioned it with Jekyll Island. We know that there was people that lived there that committed human sacrifice to infants. Okay, that's goes along with the sin in the land, that if it's not cleansed, if it's not dealt with, is going to be a curse to whoever resides there. Or from the Rockefeller point of view, a source of iniquity force power that he can tap into and go the dark side,
the dark way. Yeah. And she identifies 4 key areas, and they're idolatry, breaking covenants, bloodshed, and sexual sins. And those tend to be the 4 areas that have a defilement on the land itself. And so, as Tim Bence talked about in parts of his interview, when he dealt with some of these altars, like over in Europe, Middle East, at least for a season, there was almost an overnight change in the rates of crime and different sin issues that were going on in those regions, that it was actually bringing out more sin and criminal activity was more allowed to flourish, was more stirred up in people when these ancient defilements of the land were allowed to persist. And I think it's really interesting, too, this verse that we've quoted or heard 1,000 times, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and turn from their wicked ways, then I will cleanse them. I'm paraphrasing because I'm messing it up. Then I will forgive their sins and heal their land. So that's not just poetic language that God is using there, that we can just spiritualize. I think there's literally something going on with that healing.
Yeah, I'm very curious. To wonder if there's a Canaanite altar that's on Epstein's Island, because obviously the elites of the world are drawn to that particular area and to commit atrocities against the innocent. And most people are just thinking about the sexual side of things. Was there human sacrifice? Was it just human trafficking? Because that's in those categories.
The Nephilim host traits, exactly. No, I think that's true. That's something maybe we should do a little research on, because I thought I remember hearing something about some pictures that were taken about his the structures that are built, so like the housing and different buildings that have some occult, I don't know, some symbology there, and. Not to get too dark into this, but it's reality. So when it comes to some of the satanic Luciferian, elite and what they get into, the human trafficking part, the pedophilia part, But there's also, like you said, there's torture and there's sacrifice and there's satanic ritual abuse. I mean, it gets really, really, really dark. So I would not be surprised if that was part of what was going on there. Just real quick, I remember hearing an anecdote of a junior senator, I think he was, and he was like a year or two into his political career, and then there was like a senior senator that invited him to a mansion to have this party, and he was trying to get him initiated into some of this really dark stuff, and he's like, no thanks. But it's almost like you rise to a certain rank and then you're kind of initiated. I feel like that goes on with, whether you're like the CEO of Google or you are a movie star. It's like, I think there's a divide that they try to use to control people, politicians and so on. I know that's getting way off track, but have you guys heard anything like that as far as kind of like the top of the top? I mean, we're getting into kind of like the Bilderbergers and some of that stuff, but
it reminds me of a movie, an old movie called The Brotherhood of the Bell. And it was an initiation. It was a group that was basically in charge of the entire United States. They would recruit people from specific colleges, specific lifestyles, and they would assist that person in gaining power, gaining, huge, amounts of wealth. And then once the time came for the Brotherhood to ask a favor, at least with this in the movie, they brought this one guy who was part of the Brotherhood, for 70 or for about like 50 years and had never been called on. And then once they had him come and watch one of the rituals, and then they called on him to take out somebody high up in the government, take him out, like not as in his life, but take him out by doing certain things with his business to destroy this guy. And so I think that kind of a thing has been around for a long time, especially with Masons. People think, because there's a lot of secrecy around Masons. And obviously the words the Illuminati have come up before. But it doesn't seem too far-fetched, because if you have a group of people who, look at it on the local level even, you have a group of people who run a local village. There's certain things that they're doing that we're not knowing about, even at the local level. So.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a way of control too, because if you can get someone into a compromising situation and, photograph it, video it, or whatever, it's like now they've got you. And, if you're a politician, let's say, you're not going to be able to have as much freedom on what you want to say and how you want to vote. If you're not going to play ball, they've got something on you.
Well, do you remember Paul Ryan?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was like huge. He was coming up, and then all of a sudden he's gone.
Well, not only that, but I think he was kind of a
strange.
bright spot. He was a bright spot in my mind in the conservative side. And then the last few years, it's like he's totally part of the club.
Yep. Yeah, he won't
totally
talk
bought.
anymore. He doesn't. He just sits there.
Yep.
And not to get political,
So, yeah.
I think that's one of the reasons why there was so much hate towards Trump on both sides of the aisle, is because he was self-made, and they didn't have the kind of dirt on him like they do everybody else that's on a Republican or a Democrat. Because he remember, even he didn't announce that he was going to run as a Republican until he had to, and then he threatened to go independent, and he was a thorn in both party sides, which is why a lot of people liked him.
No, I know exactly, but he was very threatening, like you said.
Let's wrap up. I think we've exhausted this episode or this conversation. there's a lot to digest when it comes to Jekyll Island, to spiritual mapping. The Tim Bence interview, in my mind, was amazing, especially part one. And then Dr. Laura Sangler and what she has researched with her book, the roots of the Federal Reserve and how it's tied to the Nephilim there on Jekyll Island. I mean, the interviews she gave with Nate and Luke were incredible. So I know we got more that we want to talk about on this subject, but where do you think, anything else that you guys want to discuss today?
Well, I tell you what, since I don't want to give it short shrift, is that the word? I don't want to shortchange it. I do have some other notes to go through, but like you said, let's save that because I think it'll tie in well to the next part of Tim's interview where he's talking more about his spiritual background and some of the ways that he was challenged by God to come to a place where he could deal with these altars. But just to kind of set up maybe as a segue into that, some of the things I want to talk about maybe to start out next time is one of the things Tim says is he says, we don't often know, believers are asleep, and we don't often know our own history. We don't know our family history. And we don't know that God cares about the land as well as us, and he wants to deal with evil. And so I think that's just kind of an interesting idea of inquiring of God, what is in my own family's history or the geographic region that I live in. So it's important to know what defilements or iniquities are in the past so that we can deal with it spiritually. And I think it's interesting too that, I think it might have been Tim Bence, but it was also, I know Dr. Laura talked about, being able to cleanse an area, even if you are not the one at fault. She was able, with a group of people in her spiritual mapping, find a region that had ancient defilement and then repent before God. If I'm Luke, you might be able to jog my memory here, but wasn't this the time where she had? Oh boy, I'm drawing a blank on exactly the context, but do you remember her talking about like an odor, like a foul odor, and her like sensing beings rushing past her? Do you remember she talked about that in her interview?
Yeah, she did.
And when she prayed, when they prayed and they were asking God to heal the area and they were asking for forgiveness, literally the scent changed to like this sweet pine scent.
Yeah.
And that's something that is often associated with demonic type of presences, as people smell like a sulfur, awful smell. I mean, Bigfoot's associated with that. And so I think there's something to that, that scent. But the point I wanted to make there is just that if we can inquire of the Lord about different discernments of our area or our family, that it may not be us at fault, but we may be able to, on behalf of that area, come to God and heal an area, as Dr. Laura has said. So we could talk about that story more next time. And then the only other thing, I guess, to kind of segue into the next chapter of this is talking a little bit more about debt and its equation to slavery, the Federal Reserve, usurping of the authority that Congress had to create money. So that's essentially what the Federal Reserve did. And then I also think it's interesting that Tim Bence in the interview was talking about, he was talking to some Jewish rabbis about Jesus turning over the tables. Do you remember that part, guys? And how the coins had the face of Baal on it. So we can dig into some of that stuff, and then leading into what, how money works, the Federal Reserve System, and then into what Tim Bence, I believe he calls the gatekeeper's principle of how our own spiritual yielding to the Lord has an effect on the area that we live in and the people around us. And Luke, I think I called you up the day I heard that, and I was like, that is mind-blowing that we can have that type of influence. But it makes sense, because what does the Bible say? Judgment starts in the house of God. And so it's with us if my people are called by my name. So it's really, we can complain all we want.
I think it's even more than that. It's, man, my throat. It's us as believers not realizing the authority and power, and because we're made in God's image, the relationship we have. We think about politicians or people that have pull to get things done. I mean, we have a relationship with the creator of the universe, So these things that we're talking about, if we would get our heads on straight and we would fulfill our destiny as Christians, and it doesn't have to be this amazing preacher that's got these huge crowds. It's just walking out and being obedient in your circle of influence, and you have the dominion, you have the authority, you represent Christ, you can pray. Life and death are in the power of the tongue, where my feet tread, you can claim those areas for the Lord, whether it's walking in your town and you're just exercising and you just say blessings over your community.
Exactly. Do a prayer walk.
Like the Lord's Prayer said, you're pulling things out of heaven as it is in heaven, be on earth, peace so it's just exercising our authority.
That's right. And just to add to that real quick, because Luke, when you were gone a couple weeks ago, and Don and I were talking about ecclesia, that the word translated in the Bible by King James was deliberately mistranslated as church, and ecclesia means a ruling council, and that is exactly what we're talking about. And I was listening to, so that was a book by Tim Kurtz that I can share with you. And I was just listening to a clip of him on his Facebook this morning about ecclesia. And he says, he's talking about the body of Christ. And he's like, the Bible says that he has placed all things under his feet. And he says, you could be the little pinky, little baby toe of the body of Christ, and all of these spiritual opposition are still below you, because we're the body. And I was like, oh, that's a great picture. So anyway, we can kind of end with that, but yeah, good stuff, guys. So we'll
but yeah, if anybody's listening to this wants to dig into more, obviously we talked about the Tim Bence interview, which was a huge motivation and encouragement that the Lord used to prompt Dr. Laura with her research and her book. And we've got her book, you got her interviews, and then I know I got it on Audible, The Creature from Jekyll Island. It's a big book. It's about 24 hours worth of audio, being read to you. But to really get a deep dive in what is the Federal Reserve, the foundation of it, how they went with their rail cars and very secretive, and even the servants only addressed them as by their first names.
That's right, and they also sent the normal people at the club on Jekyll Island out, and they hired temporary workers for those 2 weeks. Yeah, man. Oh, so many places we could go.
Lot of resources out there. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that's by G. Edward Griffin, and I think I mentioned on a previous show he also wrote World Without Cancer. So he's got some excellent contributions to the world of nonfiction. But all right, let's wrap up right there, and we'll pick it up from that spot next time. And by the way, let's see. Today is what's today's date? The 18th? All right, so in 8 days, if all goes to plan, we will have Mr. Jed Payne from Church and Other Drugs podcast. Sunday afternoon, we're going to host him. So be thinking of questions for him and how we want to work that show out with him. So that'll be a lot of fun. All right. Thanks, guys. This is awesome. Thanks for listening to the Days of Noah podcast. We appreciate you tuning in. As always, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Send it to your friends and family to help grow the channel. We appreciate each and every listener, and thank you for your support. God bless. See you next week.